Redditors who are in law enforcement, what's the most extreme form of vigilantism you've seen? Serious. We have a lot of pedophile hunters lure predators to near our station. To be honest, they cause more trouble than a lot of the jobs are worth. They rarely give statements, their evidence is lacking, and once they organize the interception they disappear as quick as they appeared, meaning often the case is threadbare. After actually speaking with them somewhat, they are getting better at giving statements and providing the evidence they've gathered. Any idiot that agrees to meet a 12-year-old at a Wetherspoons on a railway station deserves to be intercepted by us IMHO. In my town there used to be this group of punks thugs that hanged near a jiu-jitsu gym. The fighters never stood up for themselves since they couldn't know whether or not the thugs were armed. Until one day they beat a guy up somewhat seriously. The next day the fighters got together and hatched a plan. One of them had a contact in the police, so a random search happened to apprehend any guns the punks might have. They didn't have any. Couple minutes later the whole jiu-jitsu academy comes up and beats the living crap out of them. The thugs decided to find another place to hang in. As a BJJ practitioner, this pleases me. 1974 to 1975ish. When I was little, about 5, my second oldest sister was married to this cockbag. They were splitting up and she moved back home with my toddler nephew. Her soon-to-be ex would call the house and make threats to her and about my nephew. She hadn't told my parents about this. One day, he called and my dad picked up 3-second phone at the same time my sister picked up. He heard the STBX threaten to kill my sister and nephew and to take me away until I grew up to take her place. Dad quietly told mom to tell sis that STBX needed to come over so they could talk about their marriage. Guy shows up. My dad answers and he beat that man almost dead. Neighbors called the cops and pulled my dad off while he was pounding the guy's head into the sidewalk. Dad fell in a trash bag that had a broken window pane in it. Guy had half a face left and his skull was cracked. Survived but in a mental institution for the rest of his life. Dad had to drop his drawers in front of the neighborhood to get the hide chunk removed from his butt. Mom was still trying to get to the guy while they were loading him in the ambulance. Dad pulled out his driver's license, military card, retired Air Force, Korean War, Army intelligence, early years of Vietnam, and his assistant fire chief badge. Was working at the local Air Force base, the one in Colorado with the Jolly Green Giants golf balls. Dad was not put in handcuffs but was taken into CTGE prosecutor. They looked at Dad's credentials, tried to pull his military file, couldn't. Not high enough security clearance. Listened to my dad's version of what happened, and had one of the detectives take my dad back home. He was gone for like 4 hours. That was his punishment. Well, that and the scar on his butt. Your dad is into some deep military crap. Judge prosecutor knows better and believed your dad 100% at an instant rather than jumping through the judicial system hoopla and possibly tarnish his rep by being responsible for convicting an army veteran by doing what's arguably right. Kudos to the judge prosecutor, and especially your dad. My uncle is a cop and there is a guy in Philly who does what he calls freelance investigation. The problem is he is a bit of a crackpot, so he lost his actual job. He's given them great information such as a 50-page report connecting a drug dealer in Camden to a series of muggings in Kensington and some other parts of North Philly because the guy visited his mother and sister at their house every Friday to Saturday, which was when the muggings took place. But he crashed at a friend's in Camden Sunday to Thursday. He even included photos of the guy, including 3 surveillance videos putting the guy within 2 blocks of 3 different muggings. This dude followed this guy off and on for like 7 months and led to an arrest and conviction and got a cash award. On the other hand, he also believes that a 60-some-year-old woman from Chinatown who died in the mid-2000s in a solved murder actually faked her own death and runs a drug ring, all because she had a drug conviction in the 70s for being caught with some dope outside a concert. His logic basically goes she was shot in her face to hide her identity. She has a history of drug crimes. Look, this other Asian woman at the market looks like how she did but aged another 10 years. I followed this woman. She lives within 9 blocks of where she used to before she faked her death. Her husband is in on it because they both, picture of a totally different Asian woman than the first provided, went to IKEA on the same day and talked in go make an arrest. Something that outrageous has to be true. I've made this comment before of a story my dad told me. My dad was chasing a guy down a highway that was backed up with traffic on foot. A guy with his family in the car dressed like they were on their way to church opened his car door just as the guy my dad was chasing was running by, knocking him to the ground. My dad, the guy he was handcuffing, and the guy who opened the door were all laughing at what had just occurred. That scene made me crack up. Even the guy running from the cop was like LOLFML. I'm a criminal defense attorney. Know a case where a widely known murderer threatened to kill his neighbors. The uncle of one of them heard, left straight from a funeral, walked up and shot him in the chest. Ended up being found not guilty too. Most gangster thing I've ever heard. CJ student and pursuing a career in corrections. When we were going over hospice in class, inmates dying, and get treated with care by others to ease suffering, we learned about a man nicknamed PVT Jack. He served in World War II and received plenty of honors. His son got addicted to H and hung himself. Jack killed the drug dealer and was arrested for first-degree murder and sentenced to life. He was a POW in World War II and was experienced with being locked up for most of his life at this point when he was submitted to hospice. Just watching the man acting tough while dying in that bed being surrounded with pictures of family was awful. It makes you realize how the people in prison aren't all bad people. They just make mistakes. There was a documentary on it, which we watched and covered him several times as examples of not considering the people in prison as lesser than you for being there. A friend of mine told me about a case that his wife prosecuted. 70-year-old woman walks in on her 71-year-old husband who is blowing her grandson, his step-grandson. Kid is about 12 years old. She walks to another room in the house, gets a gun, and shoots her husband once. He survives the first shot and drags himself outside onto their porch. She shoots him again in the back, killing him. The jury deadlocks on the first 2 trials, resulting in mistrials. On the 3rd trial she is convicted of manslaughter and given 30 days in jail. I bet she had bigger balls than her husband. I worked in a small Midwestern town nearly 20 years ago. Received a disturbance call and found a heavy-set 50-ish white man laying in his front yard half conscious. He was obliviously involved in a fight, smelled of gas and had burns on his legs. He was probably in shock, heavy drunk, most likely both, and refused to answer any of my questions. My partner and the guy's family arrived just as he refused medical service. It was only at this point could we get a positive ID. Since he was refusing to talk, except to say no ambulance, the female relative was concerned, while another male relative did volunteer that his uncle had just been released from prison for child molestation. The neighbors saw nothing. The victim refused to make a statement. Not much to be done. The guy was extremely lucky that we wasn't burned to a crisp. I worked for 2 more years afterward and there were no further attacks involving this guy. Immigration law here. Lost count the number of times a cheating BFGF has been dobbed in by their ex. You always know those ones are good. Lots of detail and always manage to get the target as the info is very specific. Used to work in a people trafficking team. Targets were mostly the sex massage industry, legal here, but workers are occasionally trafficked and often in the country unlawfully. Had one high-end brothel who played by the rules dobbing on all the dodgy ones. Worked well for him as we were pushing business his way. We would still do compliance checks on him, but we never had an issue. Another memorable one. Had a family keeping an Indian girl as a slave housekeeper. We got her out of that crap and into a woman's refuge and get her a visa, settled in the country, etc. Later, during the court case, we find out that she had been raped by the father and adult son at the house. She wouldn't take it further out if shame and the public prosecutor wouldn't proceed as she wouldn't give evidence. About a year later, rescued girl's family come to visit her. Her dad sets fire to this family's house less than an hour after being in the country. I think this is my favorite one. Travels halfway around the world just to burn those house down. Shortly after my grandfather came home to small town western Kansas after World War II, a young girl was raped or murdered. He's since passed and I don't remember this part exactly, but something terrible happened to a young girl and he, with the townspeople, knew who done it, while waiting for law enforcement to arrive, which in that part of the world could take hours at a time. They happened to had found the man, brought him back to town, wrapped barbed wire around his neck and dragged him through town by horse until he was a lifeless bloody pulp. Drug him through town in front of all to see, yet nobody was ever arrested. I'm sure when the cops finally did arrive nobody saw a thing. Back then, especially in rural counties, the town's going to protect their own. Not law enforcement, but when I was in high school a guy lured his best friend out to a remote field behind a tribal casino a few miles outside of town and beat him to death with a hammer, and subsequently buried him, because his girlfriend told him the best friend had raped her. There were missing person posters all over my high school 4 weeks before they found the body and discovered what had happened, and the guy kept showing up to school the whole time like nothing had happened. I went to a very homogeneous, preppy, safe high school, where things like this simply didn't happen. Turns out the girlfriend had made the whole thing up. I wish she'd share his sentence. We'll add on here as a medic as well. This guy peed someone off. When we found him he was naked in the bushes, shot through his eyeball and it came out around his ear. Trauma doctor said he had multiple broken bones from getting tossed from a moving car, had been kicked and stomped on his stomach and face, and to top it off he had been... Not sure what he did to deserve that, but someone got their revenge that night. Mall security, not real law enforcement. Many years ago, I was 18. Just started doing security at a small mall. Third day on the job. Got a call that someone had just snatched some jewelry that they were looking at. Got a vague description. Saw someone running through the mall out of the corner of my eye. So I made an assumption and took off running after him. Another shopper pointed me in the right direction as he ran outside. I saw him run into the dumpster storage area of a Burger King that was in our parking lot. So I, being young and full of adrenaline, ran into it too. Found the guy crouched behind a disgusting oils and fats bin. I have no idea how I did it, but I somehow cuffed the guy with my brand new shiny handcuffs I'd gotten 3 days ago, at which point my colleague finally showed up. Adrenaline and excitement turns you into some kind of superhuman, or the guy was super submissive. We walked him back to the mall and into a service corridor to take him to the security office and wait for the police. We're halfway down the back hallway when the door from the mall bursts open and it's the owner of the jewelry store. This isn't the first time he's been robbed. He walks towards us, calm and collected, and we tell him we caught the guy and the police are on the way. Everything is good. He got a little too close, our bad, and then punches the guy in the face, who has his hands cuffed behind his back. The guy drops to the floor. We lose our crap on the store owner, as he's just fricked up our awesome success. We push him away, but he's done what he wanted to do, so he's quite pleased with himself. I call an ambulance, and I still remember very well arguing with the 911 operator because I didn't know the address of the mall. It's XXXXXX Center. It's a mall. Everyone knows where it is. Anyway, ambulance shows up, along with the police, and they arrest both of the thief and the store owner. The thief goes to hospital, but he's fine. Few weeks later we find out that everyone dropped the charges against everyone else and life went on for everyone. Very annoying, as I wanted to celebrate my first conviction, but it wasn't to be. I call an ambulance, and I still remember very well arguing with the 911 operator because I didn't know the address of the mall. It's XXXXXX Center. It's a mall. Everyone knows where it is. Holy freaking crap, that is hilarious. I get the operator's point, but dang, that is just pure hilarity. My great uncle, his home is being robbed and he lives in a small farming village at the time, and he lives with his elderly mother and sisters. He's 60, so he's the only man of the house. So some armed, knives not guns, burglars try to break in. So what does he do? He takes a bamboo stick with knives lashed on both ends, jumps out the ground floor window, and confronts about 4-7 young 20-30 year olds all armed with knives. He puts enough of a show to scare off all 7 of them. Posted this in another thread, but it fits this one better. Where I grew up, several of the county cops were blatantly corrupt. Back around 86, one of the cops was accused of raping an underage girl. Cops wouldn't do anything. One night rapey cop stops answering radio. Next morning his petrol car is found with lights flashing. His uniform is freshly washed, ironed, and folded in the driver's seat. There is also this one family of old farm boys you don't pee off who just happened to have a hog farm on the same road they found the car on. The official story is he resigned and left town, but his brother hasn't heard from him since. Hogs will eat human bodies. Betting the evidence was pooped out by a pig. A civilian here, but here's a little wartime story from Sarajevo. When the Serbs started shelling the city, nobody was spared but a few informants and infiltrators. A while later some of these informants started being brutally killed and or had their true identities revealed by just one guy. Anyways, our wartime government didn't think killing civilians was a good idea, so they went out and hunted down this vigilante, all because we wanted to show that we were the good guys. I had a DUI defense attorney, along with several others, box in a DUI driver and force him to pull to the shoulder. The DUI defense attorney then took the guy's keys and waited for me to get there. I jokingly asked the vigilante attorney if he was planning on representing the DUI driver and he responded, "Heck no." The driver later blew .360 on the breath test, which is over 4 times the legal limit. Goddamn. A .36 is like alcoholic territory. I blew a .24 on my buddies at a party and I was beyond fricked. My other friend's dad was an alcoholic for 40 years and got pulled over at around .30. Said he felt sober and had no problem walking, just stank of vodka. A week ago in my city 2 guys broke into a house demanding money. They stabbed 3 of the residents, but then both burglars were stabbed to death by the homeowner. Was a prosecutor in a somewhat rural county. This county had an area of town that was known for violent crime and that being said, a lot of residents had lived there for a long time. They weren't overly thrilled with how the area had developed, but were generally the kind of people who were hesitant to call law enforcement. These people started a kind of city council that would meet regularly to discuss the happenings in the area and to determine appropriate responses. Sometimes they would send bruisers in to beat the crap out of someone who did something bad. This was all done hush hush without law enforcement involvement. Some officers knew a little bit about it, but it was just kinda swept under the rug as an understanding in the area. I was in a grocery store getting some lunch when I heard my partner on the radio responding to a pretty bad domestic call and asked for backup. I took off running out the store racing to my car. A kid who works at the store is all about wanting to be a cop one day and decided he wanted to come too, so he raced out to his car to follow me there. I didn't realize it until I got to the house and he ran past me trying to get into the house. He doesn't talk to me anymore after the unholy butt chewing I gave him. He's a great kid, but he fricked up bad that day. I've seen outsiders beaten to a pulp in Washington Heights, NYC, for transgressions against neighborhood stores or establishments. For example, a shoplifter who stole a few hats from the hat store and got into a tussle with the African guy who worked there. The entire neighborhood beat him up and all that remained was a bloodied perp and several axe handles scattered about the ground. No witnesses. TLC drivers also used to call for help in that neighborhood when one of them was victimized. You'd see a bunch of town cars converge on the spot to mete out justice on the would-be offender. Soldier, so not a cop but definitely did coin, was traveling with a high-ranking officer to do talks with each person in charge of bases around Baghdad. One day we go to a base I think was called Dragon something. They tell us about how they stopped getting mortar attacks. That base was set up in one of the power plants around Baghdad. They keep getting mortar every couple of nights for the first few months they are there. Guy in charge finally gets out to the local townspeople around the base and tells them if we get mortared again I'm trying off the power for 3 days. Gets mortared that night. He had the workers turn off the power. People come to the gate the next day asking why the power is off, being for it to be turned back on. Gate guards tell them it won't come on for X amount of days because someone shot mortared at the base. They turn the power back on. Get mortared a few days later. Guy turns the power back off. People come back asking, complaining. This time the guys at the gate tell them it will be off for a week because they keep getting mortared. 2 days later people come to the gate and say we got the guy who was mortaring your base. Come and we will show you. So they go out and about half a mile away they got a guy hung by his neck from a light pole, dead. It had been 2 months since their last mortar attack when we visited. Guy that robbed a nearby store was beaten senseless by the community and held for cops. He was beaten so bad I think they arrested the guys holding him down as well. Not in law enforcement, just related to the question. In my country here is a very famous case of this. A 13-year-old girl was raped by a 60-something-year-old in 1998 or something like that. Don't know if he was on jail or what, but in 2005 he ran into the mother of the girl in the street and he taunted her with things like, "How is your daughter, want to come have dinner?" So she saw as he entered a bar, went get gasoline in a gas station, went to the bar, doused him and lit a match. He died some days later. I'm just telling it from memory so some details might not be exact. This was in 2005 after all. I was molested in prison. I simply waited until I knew he was doing drugs again and called his PO so he could drop dirty and be sent back. Sorry you had to go through that. Glad you found a creative way to handle it. Not law enforcement. Surgeon neuropsychologist worked with a patient who suffered from a mass shooting from a man who was mentally unstable. The mentally unstable man thought the young men were trying to rob him by fire. He shot them. One patient was a drug dealer. Even though the sick man was arrested within 30 minutes of the shooting and it was clear he was sick, he got out of jail 28 days before this shooting for killing a woman who tried to steal his soul. He was cornered in jail and lit on fire by the drug dealer's mates. He died because of his injuries. I treated both. I have a real problem with vigilantism. Recently, a friend of mine was killed in a hit and run. He was only 21. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the usual rumor mill began. Who did it? A day later, a friend of mine began to post photos of a person whom was suspected of being the driver. Photos containing him holding a beer. Specifically, the implication being that he was a drunk who killed our friend. I called her on it. She got mad at me. She was potentially compromising an active investigation and compromising justice being served in the correct for death of our mutual friend. Posting photos of an unofficially declared suspect of a crime is not only possibly slander, it's damaging to the active investigation. She was determined to be a vigilante that caught him. I get the anger and the frustration, but you can't just go and exact your own justice without due process. There's a reason it exists. Not exactly law enforcement, but my great uncle was off in the Pacific Theater and a group of guys accosted his girlfriend. When he came home he beat one of them to death. I actually have a story. This was in Pakistan in my village some 40 years ago. There was some dude who would go around sneaking into people's houses to mess with the girls in the house. I'm not sure if he was a rapist or not because in our culture we try not to mention things like that, but I'm pretty sure he was. One of the dads caught him on his roof and threw an axe at him and killed him. We were sat in a local car park in my mate's car. We noticed another mate's van during the conversation. But suddenly there's a loud smash as some guy breaks the window of the van, reaches in and takes off with a backpack. We gave chase. This dude is running flat out down the middle of the road. My mate driving speeds past him at about 45. My other mate in the passenger seat decides to open his door and clobber the guy. There is an almighty bang and this guy catapults like a gymnast tumbler, end over end, straight through a house garden fence and smashes the front window. He staggers out bleeding from loads of grazes and cuts and starts crying like a baby. I was like, crap, that was a bit over the top. My mate grabbed the bag and kicked him back on the floor. He wasn't that badly injured, but crap, we sped off and told my other mate he had dropped the bag in the car park. It turns out later he knew the guy, a local Sikh and had helped him out with work, using the van, and he knew there was expensive tools in the backpack. Never reported it to the police and never had any comeback from it. The house was rented to students we heard and they just got the landlord to fix the fence and window. Not law enforcement, but some people nailed a suspected pedophile to a tree in a local park near where I used to live. Crap's mad fricked up. Kid from a very large and very dysfunctional family is shot with a long gun while riding his bike through the projects. The kid was more of a nuisance than a criminal, but his family had some real dysfunctional characters in it. This was in the summer of about 2007. Guess who our first homicide of 2008 was? Sorry to be posting again, but this is a good story of vigilantism. My mate was starting his property business, had about 9 houses. He had a nightclub past, ran a lot of doors and his family were well connected with the city doorman. He's in bed, wife and kids. Almighty crash and the feral youths from the pirate end of town had put his patio doors in. They took the keys to his BMW X5 and were gone before he got down the stairs. To make matters worse, he had left all his property's spare keys, with addresses in the car and his mobile. He rings his phone and gets 5 kids, who turn out to be 15-17 years olds. They taunt him, saying they are going to break into the houses. He called the police, who are next to useless and just call it in as a vehicle theft. They show no interest in the threats, so they start ringing him all night and day. Eventually it becomes a sort of who's the hardest standoff, so he gets a crew together of around 15 doormen and they find the car in a nearby town. It is being donutted around a disused shopping center. He rings the lads while watching from afar. They pass the phone amongst them, hurling abuse at him, but it gives them a chance to see who they are and who are just local kids watching the show. So they rush them tooled up. In a few seconds there are broken jaws, teeth missing and severely beaten up kids lying on the floor. This is before camera or GPS phones, so no evidence. He gets the car, keys and phone back. A few days later his phone goes and there are threats from older members of these kids' gang. They are going to burn his house down. They want him to pay cash for the injuries. He gets the crew together again and finds out who this kid is. They follow him back to his parents' house in the most goddamn lawless part of the city. They kick the door in and beat him senseless in front of his parents. The dad pee himself with fear and the war ended there. This might seem outrageous, but it goes on, and these feral kids have no morality or limits. They only respect force. No one went to the police. My mate says they are the most dangerous people he knows and will stab someone for $50. You have to go in so hard they back down. I'm in the Coast Guard. A guy on a boat moored across the marina from our station shouts at people when they go too fast. He's loud as heck. I saw this when it was first posted and thought vigilantism said vandalism, and I thought, that's not a very good question. Now it is I who is the dumb one. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.